Hi, everybody. Sharyl Attkisson here. Welcome to a Full Measure Season 10 premiere edition of Full Measure After Hours. Today, you won't hear much reporting about this in the media, but Europe is suffering a mass illegal immigration crisis that's arguably worse than the one here in the U.S. I'm very excited to be opening up Season 10 of Full Measure this week on Sunday, September 8th, with a fascinating and eye-opening story about Europe's illegal immigration crisis, arguably worse than ours, believe it or not. Before I traveled to Europe, by the way, I found that it was very difficult to find news reporting on this topic. I knew about it because of my repeat visits covering the issue in Europe. But if you do a Google search for illegal immigrant crime and that sort of thing over in Europe, you will come up with instead all kinds of articles saying that people are Islamophobic if they complain about migrants, that sort of thing. But the fact is, they are in crisis, and everywhere you go, people are talking about it. Voters are talking about it, and both left and right politicians are pledging to do something about it. In Poland, they've even built a 15-foot tall wall and authorized shoot-to-kill orders for their border patrol. First, in today's podcast, you will hear from David Cowling. He's a British political analyst I spoke with in London. When I speak to most Americans about what's happening in Europe, they are unaware that Europe's been having its own illegal immigration crisis. Can you give a top-line overview of what's been happening in the past 10 years or so?
In the past 10 years, it's been quite transformational. I mean, the numbers have gone through the roof in terms of many European countries. I mean, Italy has been a receiving area for decades with its own troubles. France, whole ghettos around Paris comprising immigrants who are not assimilated into French society as such, it seems. In Germany, a very significant increase in there. Sweden, associated with gangs and violence, Somali gangs and the rest of it. So it's been quite an incredible change that's taken place. A lot of people have been assimilated into the population, but there are concerns that quite a few of the communities really want to operate as if they are, I don't know, say Turkish or whatever, in Germany, not Germans, if you see what I mean. And so that maybe has a long-term implications for how the country adjusts itself and how it goes forward, because the aim is to meld people together, and there's plenty of evidence, I think, in large parts of Europe that hasn't quite happened like that.
Has the face of Europe changed irrevocably? And by that I mean, has there been a quick influx, meaning 2 decades instead of 100 years? Has there been a quick influx of foreigners in a way that is really changing what we thought of as Europe?
Most definitely. And you just have to look at the numbers. I mean, in Sweden, there's a relatively small population. It's taken a very large number of immigrants, and it's transforming Swedish society. In Germany, a very large number of immigrants. Italy. And Spain. And so it would seem to me to be impossible to think that such change over 20 years will not have irrevocable consequences.
And not to judge good or bad, but certainly there are people who think that is too fast. It can't be afforded. There should be more assimilation. What do you think is the changes we've seen so far? And again, most people don't seem to object to the Ukrainian. There's been a big flood of Ukrainians into Europe. And what we hear from people is they assimilate, they're more like us, they work, and they're allowed to work when they come in right away as I guess, as refugees. But what's the look or what's happening with those who are coming maybe from Muslim countries, North Africa, and so on? How's that?
Well, I mean, what's happening, I think, there is that we're discovering there's a difference between refugees coming for asylum, trying to escape oppressive regimes, and people who are economic migrants. And the great majority of people who are coming into Britain illegally, and I suspect in the States as well, are not escaping persecution. They're just wanting to do better for themselves, which is fine, but it's economic migration. It's not migration that's been invited. I mean, your country has a great history of immigration, but it's been on your terms, and it's been at a pace that you've wanted. Now your southern border is being overwhelmed by people you haven't invited. In Britain, it's nothing like as extreme, or the numbers, as you have in the southern border of the US, but nevertheless, people regularly coming across, and they think that once they land, they've hit the jackpot. There's going to be very little success in sending them back. They will be able to come into the country, they'll be able to get education and social services and healthcare, and they will be doing much better than they did when they were at home. All of that is understandable, but you can also understand why the people on the other side think, excuse me, that's not what immigration should be about. That's our decision to take as to who comes here and gets the benefit, not for you.
When we're looking at populism, back to that, which is related, what are your reflections on what you think and know of is happening in the United States compared to the trends we're seeing in Europe?
Well, in the States, I mean, you're clearly a very, very divided society. There are divisions in Britain, but it seems to me that they are so much more solid in the United States. And I think that, once again, I suspect that immigration has taken its toll, communities overwhelmed, people who would have welcomed legal immigrants 20 years ago now find themselves overwhelmed with others. So that, in a sense, knocks the conventional party system, because conventional politicians are allowing it to happen. So if they're doing that and you disapprove of it, where do you go? Well, you go to parties, you go to personalities, it seems to me, who say, no, we're not going to let this carry on. We're going to stop it, which I guess is partly some of the attraction of Mr. Trump to a large number of people. But also, I think the economic issue is an important one, because when societies prosper, so many of these problems are suppressed. They don't surface because people are getting on with their lives and overall things are going well. Times of economic uncertainty and economic decline, the collapse of manufacturing in so much of Middle America, that once those securities have gone, then your attitude towards politics and towards politicians is going to become very different, because the established politicians in that scenario have failed you and failed you badly. So you look somewhere else. So it strikes me that America seems to be in a great journey, so to speak, of trying to find where it actually wants to settle in terms of its politics.
Are all the people, do you see in Europe, who are against large numbers of illegal immigration, are they anti-immigrant or anti-Islamic, Islamophobic?
Some are, but most are not. Most are not. Most are really welcoming. Just as you in the States, you're a very hospitable sort of population in my limited experience. In Britain, if you look around London, where there is a very large immigrant population, perhaps about a quarter, you'll see communities, white and black and brown, side by side, rubbing shoulders without resentment. But there are some, clearly, for whom it's too much, or they don't like it. But I think it's the bulk of the public opinion on the subject, the bulk of public objection is a reasoned one, rather than let's go and burn a mosque down, let's go and throw bricks and let's cause riots and burn police cars.
Speaking of which, as we sit here, there has been unrest in, is it London or does it extend outside of London?
It was Manchester, Sunderland, Aldershot. Forgive me, these are places that won't resonate greatly with your audience, but they were across England. Can
you explain just in simple terms what the disputes are over?
The thing that's provoked them was a young man went into a kindergarten and stabbed to death 3 children, 3 young girls, and badly wounded about half a dozen others. An appalling occasion, appalling slaughter. Media quickly picked up and accused the person who was the alleged murderer of being an illegal immigrant who had just come over on one of the boats. Not true. You might have lots of reasons for disliking, even hating somebody who does that sort of thing, but he was born in Britain and his brother was born in Britain. But social media stoked this up, and what it discovered was that there were people who were only too ready, to come and throw stones and set fire to police stations and police cars because of that.
By the way, the alleged murderer in the mass stabbing in England is a teenager, the son of Rwandan immigrants. Mark Francois is a Conservative member of Parliament in the UK. The Conservatives lost their long-standing majority in Parliament in the most recent national elections. Francois says that's in part because of their failure to deliver on their promise of stemming illegal immigration. Here is Member of Parliament for the Conservative Party, Mark Francois. What would you say are the driving issues that caused your party to lose so many seats?
There are several. I think firstly, people felt that we hadn't delivered on our promises. We'd been in government for 14 years. We'd promised a number of things, some of which we certainly achieved. We promised that we'd get Brexit done and leave the European Union. We did. We legally left the EU. But there are some other areas, particularly in relation to immigration and stopping illegal migrants coming across the Channel. The Prime Minister promised that he would stop the boats, was the slogan, and we didn't stop them. And a lot of people were very angry about that, and they took it out on us in the general election.
How does this dynamic play into the issues of what we call populism? There are trends, I think, around the world where people are expressing discontent or fatigue with whoever's the party, the ruling politicians, and making changes. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I used to have a lot to do with the EU. I was a big critic of the European Union. And often the EU establishment would use the term populist as a term of derision. It meant they would use it to insult other politicians they didn't agree with, often because those politicians were recommending a course of action that the EU establishment didn't want to do. So in a European context, at least, the term populist is often used by people in the establishment to deride people who've got radical ideas with which they don't agree.
Do you agree with that characterization? What are your thoughts about populism and any trends?
Well, you would hope that politicians would do things which might be popular. So I don't think that it's right to deride people just because they say something that the common man or woman might well agree with, even if to some people in the metropolitan elite those suggestions are politically incorrect. I think the using that term usually means that the people in the establishment haven't always got an answer to the problem.
Would you say your party is an establishment party?
Not always. Under Margaret Thatcher, famously, we won 3 general elections in a row by being radical. But perhaps over the last 14 years, we got too comfortable. We ducked a number of difficult decisions. We fell back, perhaps in some cases, on platitudes. And when it came to the general election, people gave their opinion on that. And if I'm honest, we didn't run the best general election campaign we've ever ran. We had a campaign with a number of big errors in it.
From what you describe, it sounds like you're hearing that constituents and voters were tired of giving a chance to who was in charge, which was your party, and not feeling like they were being listened to.
Someone once wrote that the most precious quality in politics is the benefit of the doubt. And by the time we got to this general election, people were no longer giving us the benefit of the doubt. That was very evident when you went door knocking on the doorsteps.
What kinds of things did people say to you?
They were frustrated, not just about not stopping the boats, but there were some economic measures that we promised, not all of which we'd managed to bring in. There were some things in the field of law and order that we hadn't quite carried through. So there was a sense of frustration. on the doorsteps, and because of that, people weren't giving us the benefit of the doubt, and they were giving it to Labour. We have our budget on the 30th of October now, when the government set out their fiscal and tax plans for the year ahead. I suspect on that day the Labour government's honeymoon will end, because it looks like there are going to be some serious tax rises, which they tried to hide in the election. On the 30th of October, they'll probably all come out to the open. That won't be very popular either.
Considering what's been going on here in terms of illegal immigration in the past decade, you might be surprised if I tell you I think most Americans don't even know that there is an immigration issue in Europe when I talk to them. How would you explain in very simple terms what's been happening here to an American who hasn't kept up on it?
Well, it's not entirely dissimilar to your situation with the southern border. And the last time I was in Washington meeting with congressmen, lobbying them to support Ukraine, I should add, this issue of the southern border came up again and again. So it's a very big issue in American politics. In our case, it's illegal migrants getting on boats coming across the English Channel into Britain, and it's an equally evocative issue here. You've had a debate about whether or not to carry on building a wall. We've had a debate about what we should do about those people coming over in small boats. And the Conservative Party had a method of dealing with that. In the end, the electorate didn't seem completely convinced. We lost the general election. But now Labour don't seem to have much of an answer either. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But it's as big an issue in Britain as it is in America.
In 2016, or that time period, I think the last many Americans heard was that Germany and Europe was opening its arms to as many who wanted to come over. Please come, we'll take you, we love you. And not so much coverage was given to sort of a radical shift when I think there were culture clashes, there were some terrorist attacks in Germany. There have been some economic realities that have happened since then. What is the mood now? When we interviewed people, even some, both on left and right, including the left, I mean, say they now want to control or think that's a big issue about controlling the uninvited immigration.
Well, the world is changing. We now have these mass migration flows, partly for economic reasons. And so you're getting millions of people on the move. And in this country, we have a generous tradition of providing asylum to people who are genuinely in fear of their lives. But within that context, many people who you and I might call economic migrants have attempted to exploit that system to the point where a lot of the public sympathy for the old system has gone. So one of the debates that we're having in Europe is how do we update our rules and regulations, particularly something called the European Convention on Human Rights, which was written in the aftermath of the Second World War. How do we update those kind of rules and regulations in order to try and prevent these sorts of migration flows? In other words, we're trying to deal with a 21st century problem with legislation that was written in the mid-20th.
My last question has to do with the changing face of Europe, something sort of like I'm thinking of it in those terms. Regardless of what happens in the future, both the U.S., I don't think even if Donald Trump says he would expel illegal immigrants, I don't think there's a way to practically do that with millions of people who've had children there and so on. Here, would you say the face of Europe is inextricably changed? What Europe looks like now as opposed to 10 years ago as a result of a very quick influx of migrants?
That certainly changed politics. But I think the biggest challenge here now in Europe is the threat from Russia. And this is something that flows back to the United States. And one congressman said to me on the visit I mentioned earlier, why should I be asked to send taxpayer dollars to Europe to pay for your defence against Russia? To which I replied, because you're a member of NATO and it's cheaper than sending your sons and daughters. We have to stop Vladimir Putin, and history teaches us time and again why that is. We didn't stop Adolf Hitler until it was nearly too late, and I hope we don't make the same mistake, both Brits and Americans, about Vladimir Putin.
I did think of one more question.
Please.
The people on the side of, even again, those on the left seem to have sentiment and support for instituting some kind of control for the illegal immigration. But in the same breath, people who support mass migration to date accuse those on the other side of all pretty much being Islamophobic or hateful or racist. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't agree with characterizing anyone that is opposed to mass migration as a racist. I think it's important that we debate these matters sensibly and democratically, because our populations have to feel that their politicians don't lack the courage to talk about this issue. If those politicians, because they're worried about being criticised in a progressive media, don't talk about those issues, then they're providing space to real genuine extremists, not populists, but extremists, who will exploit that vacuum in a way that ultimately leads to serious violence.
Our full episode on this topic and the changing face of Europe in the face of illegal immigration kicks off Season 10 of Full Measure Sunday, September 8th. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and that if you did, you will leave us a terrific review and be sure and share it with your friends. Check out my other podcast, the Sharyl Attkisson Podcast, and you can visit my store anytime. Go to SharylAttkisson.com and click the store tab to see some exciting products for independent thinkers, all supporting independent journalism causes. There are products such as ones bearing the slogan, "I need to find some new conspiracy theories. All my old ones came true." And by the way, my brand new book was just released this week, Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. I call it a true life thriller, explaining in exacting detail with sites and anecdotes as to how and why collusion between media, government, elected officials, and our medical establishment is making us sicker, even as we spend record amounts of money on healthcare, medicine, doctors, and insurance. Proceeds from Follow the Science support independent reporting. Until next time.